Drones, artificial intelligence, robotics, these are cutting-edge technologies. Tonight's guest wants to put these technologies in the hands of the poorest people on the planet. Welcome to the Disruptive Innovation Festival, a 3-week online festival exploring the question, the economy is changing, what do I need to know, experience and do? My name is Joe Murphy and I'm really excited to be the host in this live show. Joining me tonight is Jonathan Ledgard. Jonathan has made a career as a foreign and political war correspondent with The Economist. He has reported from over 60 countries, including America, Russia, Eastern Europe, most of Africa, the Middle East and Afghanistan. The list goes on. Now, Jonathan splits his time between the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, down the road from CERN, where he hangs out with scientists and technologists, and rural East Africa. His focus now is working to take technology fresh out of the laboratory and directly into the field. Jonathan, the title of our talk today is Saving Lives and Creating Jobs with New Technologies. Let's get straight to the meaty stuff. What technologies are we talking about?
I think I'm really interested in next generation technologies. So I think what we'll talk about today is stuff which is coming down the pipe in 3-5 years' time, which is pretty exciting stuff. I see you've got a slide here. That is probably the reason, in fact, that's the single reason that I'm sitting on this couch right now.
That mobile phone?
Particularly that one. That's a Nokia 1100 phone.
I remember it well.
Yeah. You remember the little snake game and all of those things?
Intimately.
This is, the reason I put it next to a Kalashnikov is it's known in Africa as the Kalashnikov of Communication. And those are the two most significant design innovations to hit Africa since the Second World War. 53 million of these phones were bought in Africa, and they really proved one very simple point, which is that you can take a very advanced piece of technology and put it in the hands of a very poor person at massive scale. And that thought changes quite a lot.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like what you're saying is that access to technology and really almost just letting go and seeing where that takes us is critical.
I think we really have to start thinking way out of the box when it comes to advanced technologies. Of course, as I'm sure we'll discuss, one doesn't want to be naive. There are very strong limitations, and in no way would you say that advanced technology is more important than the rights of girls or women or property rights or environmental questions. But it's a low-hanging fruit. And quite frankly, if we don't get the advanced technology question right in a big way, you're not going to see your circular economy, ever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it really resonates. I definitely, I've been to Africa and spent some time in Sierra Leone and could really see the direct benefit of mobile networks, people using them to pay salaries, transfer money around the country. I've also seen where technology has been implemented and used in not such a productive way. So, for example, there was a medical centre that had a solar panelled pump fitted to the well there, and when I visited it, the pump was broken, and so was totally unused because no one in the community knew how to fix it. How do we handle those kind of questions around?
Well, that's a big topic, and there are many experts who deal with technology in development. Essentially, technology has to pay its own way incrementally, day by day, and you need a kind of living network which is actually going to earn a little bit of money. That's what we see with the mobile phone system. A few years ago, I was reporting in Somalia, and it was during a famine, and I was interviewing a jihadist commander in a very remote part of South Somalia, and literally the children were dying of hunger in this place, and yet this jihadist commander had 2 working mobile phones, working off 2 different networks, and that is probably among the most messed up places I've ever been in the planet, and yet the mobile phone network continues. It's very robust, and so I think the first point for our audience to really consider is that these traditional problems we have with some technologies in poorer countries maybe don't apply to some of the next generation technologies. We might see that some of these technologies, we can talk a little bit about virtual reality, augmented reality technologies, talk about blockchain in finance, innovation. There are a lot of robust technologies which are about to come online, which will make a lot of money for a lot of people, but more importantly, they will be able to share a lot of value with people who have very low incomes.
And I would kind of love to dig more into that scenario that you explained there, because I think the experience that you've had really is hugely unique and valuable to this whole conversation. But we touched on in the intro, you really have been and lived and worked in lots of different places. When we talk about the poorest people on the planet, our minds immediately jump to kind of developing economies as a term, and that's a really big term. Where are we talking about here? Can we set some boundaries for this purpose of this conversation? What countries or what characteristics are we looking for when we're having this chat?
Am I allowed to show you a slide?
You are, yeah.
So I was told that the slides were verboten. Okay, just very quickly. Now, Latin America is a little bit problematic, but because obviously it's a very varied economy, but it's based in between the tropics. So I think it's this, particularly this belt here, Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, across into Melanesia. I think there, we probably at some point should talk about the human demography there and what is actually happening. But everything that I'm working on and thinking about is referenced in this part, equatorial belt of the planet.
And are there any kind of characteristics or kind of reasons why this part, why the equatorial part?
Well, first of all, the population is very, very dense, and it's growing incredibly fast. So, when Her Majesty the Queen took to the throne, the population of Africa was about 450 million. Before she passes on, the population of Africa will be 1.6, 1.8 billion, and it's going to top out over 3 billion. And we can talk also about Ethiopia to get people's heads around this shift. I mean, the shift is just extraordinary. I mean, right now, we're in 2016, the ratio of young Africans to young Europeans, including Russian kids, is about 2.2 African kids to 1 European kid. Today, by 2025, that shifts to 4 to 1. So what is coming down the pipe from this region of the world has never been seen in human history before. And we already can see that our political and economic systems are a wee bit fragile at the moment, and they are likely to get more so. And we're not even factored in the environmental, ecological stress that these countries will be under. Nevertheless, I'm very, very optimistic, I feel, but we need to get a little bit smarter.
So it sounds like, I mean, people have been hopeful, I suppose, about the development, economic development of these areas. You hear the term leapfrogging mentioned a lot. People have been hopeful about that for decades, and there's been periods of excitement and then disappointment. And that question, I suppose, of why now, you answered it in part by saying is that we are facing a huge change in the demographics. There might be some push for us. On the technology side, the more maybe optimistic side, why now? That we're having this conversation.
I mean, point one is the human situation is very dynamic and very explosive. In every possible way, it can be explosive, and obviously that will also include new forms of terrorism as well. So we set that to one side. On the technology side, we can call it the second machine age or the fourth industrial revolution. There are various terms which are out there at the moment, but we see a convergence of advanced technologies where different technologies start to speak to each other, start to speak to other humans in real time, and then there are sensor systems. Basically, the world becomes hyper-connected. So robotics get much cheaper, and they are injected with artificial intelligence, and then they're connected on the network. What we will see in the next 10 years is going to be bigger than anything we've seen since the advent of the laptop, for sure. And I'm pretty sure it'll be bigger than the mobile phone and the smartphone.
Just to illustrate that, maybe for some of the people watching, are there any kind of examples you're thinking of, actual technologies that you kind of feel fit that category, that tell the story of the robotics power and maybe the artificial intelligence and the machine learning being applied to that?
Yeah, I mean, we're really at the beginning of this journey right now. So I think I maybe would point out some of the work I've been doing around flying robots, or you call them drones. Drone is essentially, it's a cheap robot. And we were thinking with my group about, can you build larger drones which can carry stuff in remoter parts of Africa where there's simply not enough money to build out the ground infrastructure, roads, railways. I think that's one very, very good example. I think we can go right across the board and looking at energy systems, you look at drip feed irrigation, looking at healthcare. I mean, this particular belt here in Africa, there's hardly a heart operation that happens in that section of the world. Mm-hmm. If you have any heart problem, if you're not rich enough to make it to Dubai or Johannesburg, forget it. You're gone. And similarly with cancer treatment. So I think you'll see a lot of cheap robotics in medical surgery. So, but it goes right across the board. We could talk all day about specific examples.
I mean, just listening to you there are a few hooks that are running through my head that I'd love to jump into. You mentioned drones and the ability in a way to just almost not design out the problem of road infrastructure, because that is a problem. Moving goods from A to B around the country in rural Africa is challenging. How do you see that working today? Where is that at? I mean, when we think of drones, we think of Amazon delivery, pantry delivery. What do you see in your context?
Well, I mean, I think the first obvious point is the physics are always going to be against drones lifting any economy. And I think one of the important other points to get across today is that we should be looking at supplementing existing technologies. I mean, I think we've been a little bit infected by Silicon Valley disruption, and in fact, I see you are disruptive. And I would prefer, especially since you guys are circular economy, to be more like supplemental. It should be SIF and not DIF, because not always it's about disruption. You want motorbikes, you want lorries, you really need railways, but if we just take Africa, it's got a $55 to $60 billion public deficit spend on infrastructure every year. That means that amount of money is needed just to stand still. So in many ways, Africa is actually going backwards under the pressure of its human population. In that context, flying robots or cargo drones can add a little bit into your economy. Maybe they'll add 3-5% of transport capacity. And as you say, they're not going to be flying in a tub of frozen yogurt onto your lawn in Nevada, which is what Amazon will do. You're actually going to be flying medicines, spare parts, and e-commerce, and improving postal systems which have fallen apart in the last couple of decades. So there's a really significant possibilities there for that technology. But I'm super excited about it as a sort of vanguard, as a proof of concept for other cheap robotic technologies to achieve significant scale.
I mean, it sounds like the mobile phone was something that became cheap and accessible, and when it was kind of rolled out at scale across Africa, it allowed and other countries, it allowed the movement of information from A to B, which actually created the network. And what the picture I'm getting in my mind is a very similar picture of a networked effect, but with physical objects moving from A to B.
Yeah, I mean, information, it's incredible that information can ping around, and that has an enormous impact for poorer parts of the planet. It also makes things a little bit more urgent politically. I mean, we see from the Arab Spring, when information flows around, it's not always a happy ending. Sometimes things spin off in more complex directions. But if we think in very simple terms, these countries are doubling their population before I retire. So they're going to have 70% to 80% unemployment. The young people are better educated than any African or South Asian has ever been in history. They watch English Premier League football, they watch Hollywood movies, they're on Facebook, they're on Google, they know what they're missing. So the pressure is intense. And in order for those economies to have any chance of growing, circular or otherwise, they need to move stuff around physically. And what you actually see in many of these countries is, I can just point that this bit here is Nigeria. So Nigeria has big city Lagos, and most of Nigeria's economy is funneled through Lagos and then up to the secondary cities. And the secondary towns don't talk to each other at all. So, and that's true of Angola, it's true of Kenya and Tanzania, and it's true of most of these countries which were very heavily colonized, and the colonial economic history was about natural extraction. So you might have built one railway, a couple of roads to pull out your minerals, your forestry products, and your oil and your tea and your coffee, and it was kind of a hoover out of the country. So there is a huge opportunity to connect those secondary towns, which maybe have 300,000 or 400,000 people now, but will end up with 1 million or 2 million people, and there you can create different networks. So So I'm hugely optimistic about that.
Mm-hmm. No, it's great. I mean, and I think it's good to reinforce that there are some risks and there are some challenges posed by this just dramatic growth and change, evolution in a demographic, really, because we are talking about people moving into a different bracket of disposable incomes. That can often be perceived as quite a negative thing, but there are opportunities that come with that. As we were talking before, you were referencing just from the economics angle, how that could work with land prices in the city. It'd be great if you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's a simple point, but it's quite profound. I mean, I was back in Nairobi and met with a friend who was a professor at the University of Nairobi, who was sitting on the committee at the university, and he said, "Oh, it's really strange, but we always used to be so poor, and then we realized we have 700 hectares of land in central Nairobi, so we can actually lease out some of this land, and they will pay for us to build new buildings for the university." And you see that all across Africa, that simply a rising population creates almost organically its own economy, because human beings, they need food, they need energy, they need shelter, and these things create new markets. So I think there are a lot of reasons to be optimistic, plenty of reasons to start thinking in new ways and new directions. I mean, one thing which drives me absolutely bonkers from an economic, political, and a technology point of view is that there is no serious conversation about the role of the motor car in these countries. I mean, if you want to know how bad our thinking is about technology, we have mega cities in Africa, say Kinshasa in Congo, which may have 7 million people, may have 9, may have 11 million people. Nobody knows, which is crazy again. But, why is Kinshasa running on motor cars? Why on earth? It's completely mad. They don't make any motor cars. They're buying in rubbish motor cars from Asia, which are dumped onto their market. Middle-ranking civil servants are paying 40-50% of their salary just to run a motor car, which then sits in a traffic jam for 3 or 4 hours a day. We really need to start thinking in a broader, more futuristic way about how to bring online new technologies, and which is why I'm so excited to be here in COWS, but to think about new ways of sharing goods, new ways of thinking about how an economy might look like if your per capita income is less than $1,500 a year, which de facto across that whole equatorial belt is going to be true of most people. $5 a day by 2020, 2025 is going to be a pretty good outcome, and I'm not sure we're going to get to that much. But if you only have $5 a day, you really have to think in much more innovative ways about,
And there is a natural resourcefulness and natural intelligence that exists in these countries. When I was living in Sierra Leone, people would fix a car by the side of the road using all types of stuff. And you can, when we talk about leapfrog, as a question that just came in is, what do we mean by leapfrog? And that often, I suppose you could interpret that meaning from moving from ahead of what you would consider the developed Western economies. But there is a risk that we kind of lose some of that natural intelligence that exists, that natural resourcefulness that exists in these countries, and that's also an interesting thing to consider, I suppose.
I don't think we're going to lose it at all, actually. I think we should understand that most of these countries are not going to be industrial. They're not going to be post-industrial. They're just never industrial countries. The industrial base will remain in Eastern China and Southeast Asia for a whole host of complex reasons to do with energy prices and shipping and so on. So these economies are going to have to develop in a very, very different way, you know. I think innovation in the combination of the informal work sector with all of our energy and innovation with some of these new advanced technologies is really promising. And I mean, you were talking about leapfrogging. I'm not sure I like that term, leapfrogging. I think it's one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot. I think what is more useful to think about is everyone knows in business you have a first mover advantage. But in advanced technology, there seems to be a last mover advantage. So if you've never had infrastructure put on the ground and there are no players in the economy in that space, you're able to think in a cleaner, purer way. I think that is where we're going to see 3 or 4 big technologies come online in the next decade, which have real potential to improve significantly the quality of life for literally billions of human beings. And especially when we think about artificial intelligence, will really be critical to managing natural resources, energy systems, water resources, and so on.
Yeah, and I think there's so many pieces that I want to jump in on there. And the last mover point, I suppose, is is illustrated a bit by in America, for example. Now, I don't know if you can really go to a shop and pay with chip and pin. I mean, you couldn't for a long time, and that was because they were so heavily invested in that banking infrastructure that as the new technology came in, they weren't embracing it. But we were going to take a quick break. This might very much feel like the pinnacle of the diff, but it's not. In fact, it's not even the last session tonight. Fortunately, we've got Isaac, who's going to tell us a bit more about what is on the horizon.
Thank you so much, Joe. This year at the Disruptive Innovation Festival, we are running about 300 sessions, and I would like to tell you a little bit more about some of them. Immediately after this session, at 8 o'clock UK time, you can join the session Making a Habit of Thinking Like a Systems Thinker. And in this session, you will learn more about why we get comfortable with the way we think. And tomorrow at 1 o'clock UK time, you can join this session, Cities of Opportunity. And you can learn more about what business opportunities that might appear in our cities in the future. And you shouldn't worry too much if you miss a session, because most of our sessions are available for catch-up on our website. So go to thinkdiff.co if you want to catch up. One session that I recommend you to catch up on is this one, The Rise of Digital Technology, with the author Douglas Rushkoff. This one took place today and is one of our headline acts. And you can also find the Disruptive Innovation Festival on social media. You find us on #ThinkDiff or @thinkdiff_. That's all from me. Back to you, Joe.
Great, thank you, Isaac. So we've had some questions come in, Jonathan, while we were talking to Isaac.
Gosh, that's terrifying.
Yes, this is
sort of streaming
live, unadulterated questions. So, I mean, before we left, we were talking briefly about, we were talking intensely about technologies, and we were talking about sectors where I think you were referencing that these countries were never going to become industrialized in a sense. Let's start with the technologies. So a question from JP Denke online says, what gives you the confidence that that the next 10 years will be bigger than anything we've seen before? Can you give us any juicy insights to help, I don't know, prove that point?
I mean, obviously it's a longer conversation. You really want to fill out that conversation with 100 Financial Times editorials. But essentially, the headline point is the price point on technologies has collapsed. I can give if we just go back to drones, for example, the large drones that are being manufactured now are coming down to a price point of $400 or $500. 2 years ago, if you could have bought a drone like that, it would be $50,000, $60,000, or not available at all. When you add in the advances in 3D printing and the idea that people can pull something off the some material stuff off the marketplace, and then they can print some stuff either at home or in their community, then the price point it collapses even further, and the customization collapses. I was mentioning that the kind of drones that we're manufacturing now, the entire brain of a drone is going to cost $40 to $60. And the camera in the drone is the same camera you have in the Samsung Galaxy phone. So that camera, again, would have cost you hundreds, if not thousands of dollars 2 years ago. So it's about this convergence of technologies all coming together. And of course, we don't want to get into dystopian questions about artificial intelligence. That's further down the road, and that's probably not for this discussion. But there are simple forms of machine learning which are starting to hit the marketplace, which really will have significant impact. Conceptually, this doesn't exist yet, but I can give an example of if you're in a very hot, dry, arid country, and you're maybe not the very poorest farmer in your community, you've got a little bit of land, maybe 2 hectares of land, and you find it very, very hard, especially with climate change, to harvest your crops. One big problem you have is irrigation. It's very easy to imagine that you take a little robotic widget costing $30, maybe down to $20. You inject that with some artificial intelligence, and you link it to a very cheap hose pipe, and then you've got Israeli-level drip feed irrigation, which is going to double, your crop productivity. And there are many examples like that where you take a tiny bit of very advanced technology and quite a large chunk of low technology, and something new is going to happen. And if there's one disruption which I would like to, disrupt, it is middle technologies. So,
what do you mean by middle technologies?
Middle technologies generally are technologies which are imported from China, mass-produced, and they're sold on the marketplace by middlemen, so basically traded technologies. Sometimes, like motorbikes, they're very, very cool. I mean, it's pretty hard to improve on a motorbike as a piece of technology, and I think that's going to be a very pervasive technology going forward. Similarly with radios, it's a very sticky technology. But there's so much rubbish technology. Air conditioners, we can just take as one example. Why are we dumping air conditioners into very poor countries? And then the buildings are constructed out of plate glass and concrete, which is again imported from China. Most of these middle technologies are a short-term gain for the manufacturer and the seller, and for the user and for the communities are a pretty retrograde technology.
So I suppose a low technology would be the analogy of a bucket and spade or something, and a middle ground technology is the air conditioner and fridge, and we're really talking about high-end technologies.
Yeah, for myself personally, I'm very, very interested in the super advanced technologies, and as I said, really focus 3, 5 even 7 years out into the future. And really, we made a terrible mistake with mobile phones. We made it again with mobile money. We made it again with smartphones. We made it again with the social media phenomenon, which is we see technologies coming down the pipeline and we don't think in a profound economic and cultural way, how could they be accessible to 70% of the planet, which doesn't happen to have a large take-home salary. So that to me, you don't want to see that mistake happening again, because of the way venture capital works, particularly in Silicon Valley. You see a lot of philanthropic talk, but the reality is that the technologies are not developed for poorer people. So I think there's a real opportunity here to think way out of the box and to allow these new technologies to come online. I mean, you get in on the ground floor right at the beginning and think about it at that stage.
And so, I mean, just to summarize for my own benefit, this idea that we have, technology with robotic technology or hardware technology that has very much more functional than things that we have had before, and it's becoming increasingly affordable. The price is falling through the floor, and we're able to embed computing power that we've never known it. The second part that I wanted to come on to, and maybe hard to avoid this very cool little illustration here, but the sectors where you see this technology being applied in these countries, could you give us an example of where you see this technology being applied, and maybe make that real through some use case that you seem to have up here?
Okay, I think it's probably a good point just to say, for me, especially having worked for The Economist for a long time, I'm quite a cynical, pragmatic guy. So I think show and not tell is quite effective. So in my group, we started thinking about these cargo drones, and this just illustrates what we're talking about. But once we started thinking about cargo drones, we started to think about the use case of those drones. I'll just flick through these slides. Now, yeah, so drones, they need somewhere to land. So we call that a Droneport. This is how a Droneport in a small African town might look. This is my one big claim today, is that I think within 10 or certainly 15 years' time, most towns in Africa and many towns in South Asia will have a Droneport. And that Droneport will take a portion of the time-sensitive goods and transport those goods quietly and rapidly to other Droneports on a network.
So what was that timeline?
Yeah, 10 to 15 years.
You heard it here, 10 years. Right,
Yeah.
we're counting from now. We'll
Absolutely.
see. We'll check back in.
It's going very fast.
It won't be called the diff in 10 years. It'll be called the SIF.
SIF, exactly. That's what we need. That will be my... What we did was we realized, and I think this is very, very relevant to the circular economy discussion. If you have venture capital money, it's high risk, high return. You could probably handle that with advanced technology in poorer countries. What is very hard to handle is the timeline with which venture capital wants the money back. They want the money back sometimes as soon as 2 years, sometimes 4 years, not often longer than that. The time frame for a payback which would have value for larger numbers of people is probably going to be more like 8 or 10 years. So everything we're doing and thinking about is building in not just the low income level, but the fact that you have to create jobs, you have to create labor, you have to create local value. So we started thinking about what a Droneport would actually look like. And I went to Norman Forster, British architect, who's built the largest airports in the world. And some of you will have seen also the Reichstag in Berlin or the Gherkin in London. He's one of the greatest architects in the world, and certainly the greatest architect to think about the relationship between sky and ground and sky. So I went to Norman and I said, look, you've built the biggest airport in the world. Can you build me the smallest? So we really spent a year thinking through what a Droneport would look like. And this is what we plan to build in Africa next year. It's hard maybe for the viewers to see, but this shell is actually made of rammed earth dug out of the ground. And it's a really good example of what I'm talking about with low technology and tiny bits of super high technology, because we had engineering team from Cambridge, MIT, and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology who did the mathematics on the structure. But the local community can build it quite easily themselves, and the cost of the building is about the same as a petrol station in the same town. So that was our challenge. Could we build a great civic building for the same cost as a petrol station in the same town? And the answer seems to be yes, we can. And a building like that has to have let me see, it has to have this multiple function, you know. So it has a medical function, it has a commerce function, and it has also a digital fabrication lab as well. And we thought a lot about that. That's just where the drones, that's kind of how the drones will look. They're not those annoying quadcopter drones which have ruined people's wedding photos for the last couple of years.
That looks very kind of sleek and stylish.
We can say that unless the technology is cheap enough, robust enough, safe enough, but also it has to be aesthetic, it has to be beautiful. And I would think it has to pass to the grandmother test, which is if you were to take your grandmother outside and show her a line of these cargo drones flying in the sky, she would either be indifferent or find them beautiful.
Okay, I'm glad you brought in indifferent there, because I think just beautiful might be too high a bar to reach. I mean, this looks like a fascinating project. You said you're going to build something next year. Where exactly are you in development? Have you pilot built some of the structures? What's happening?
There is a thing called the Venice Biennale, which is the largest showcase of architecture and engineering and design on the planet. And this year we were effectively selected as the pavilion for planet Earth. And we built like one section of the Droneport in Venice at the Biennale, and they experimented with the form and the structure. We have an agreement with the government of Rwanda to build the first 3 Droneports there. But I think there will be other people who come along with a similar idea, and my personal feeling is that Chinese companies will move very, very fast into this space. And we'll see China is already building railways, motorways in Africa, and it will probably seed those railways and motorways with these cheap Droneports.
And that point that you made around it having to pay, and I think that's a really critical point for a lot of what we talk about here at the, in the foundation, is that this is not just a conceptual idea. This works in the real world, and it can't, the solutions, the business models around these innovations can't be. They have to fund themselves, otherwise they'll never compete. They might remain a pet project, or they might never really scale. there will be a business model around that. And how have you kind of done forecasting around that? How is that going to work based on the people that you imagine using the service that you'll provide?
Well, I would slightly qualify, particularly if we're talking about the circular economy approach, I would qualify what you said slightly, and I would say that the system has to pay, but you have to be imaginative at the beginning, drive down the price point on the technology so that it can scale. Systems can pay at massive scale, and that's obviously why the mobile phone gets into the hands of very, very poor customers, that there is a massive scale behind it, and pennies on the pound. And I think what we've been trying to do with this particular project is not to say we are going to be building this industry, but rather to say the industry is going to happen. It will happen. It's a cognitive certainty that we will use the sky more intelligently than we used it at the moment on a crowded planet. How should that industry look like if you want it in the hands of people in Eastern Congo or Northern Nigeria, wherever? It has to be tough, has to be locally repaired, it has to be cheap. And I always say that the cargo drone of the future, if it works, will be like if you took a Citroën de Chevaux, you remember those tough cars? What would I say? A Volkswagen Beetle.
Okay, got one of those.
Yeah, okay. Volkswagen Beetle goes to a nightclub, meets a Star Wars fighter, and they get drunk, have a love child. That's the love child, is the cargo drone, right? So it has to have the Star Wars element, LED lights, super fast, next generation, but it has to be very robust and simple at the same time.
We are out of time. And
already?
What a note to end it on. Always good to finish with a reference to a Star Wars linked love child. But thank you so much for joining us today. I mean, we could go on and on with that. I just want to summarise. We've had Jonathan in with us today. We've heard that we're going to have to rename the diff to the SIF. He's absolutely stormed us and won best dressed diff participant. And he's put a stake in the ground and claimed that we'll have a drone port in, was it every part of Africa, every African country in 10 years?
Every town, over 20, 30,000 people.
There you go. So this session ends now. The diff goes on. You heard from Isaac earlier what's on over the next few days. Sign yourself up for a MyDiff account and you'll get access to all of this great content for the next 30 days. But for now, that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Jonathan. That was excellent. And see you next time.